quiet return. The familiar grumble of the approaching bus, a sound as integral to Willow Creek as the murmur of the river, stirred Milo from his contemplation of a particularly stubborn knot in his fishing net. He glanced up, his gaze sweeping past the faded murals adorning the general store, past the idling pickup truck, and settled on the dusty road leading into town. A small crowd had already gathered, mostly families anticipating the return of their loved ones. Milo felt a familiar flutter in his chest, a mix of anticipation and trepidation he hadn't fully acknowledged until now. The bus, a behemoth of chrome and tired paint, sighed to a halt, its air brakes hissing like a disgruntled serpent. The door swung open with a hydraulic wheeze, revealing a silhouetted figure in the opening. Milo's breath hitched. He knew that silhouette even after all this time, even with the subtle changes etched into its very lines. Connor. He emerged, stepping onto the cracked asphalt with a deliberate slowness that hadn't been there before. Gone was the eager, almost bounding energy Milo remembered. This Connor moved with a quiet precision. His eyes, even from this distance, seemed to scan his surroundings with an almost unsettling intensity. His shoulders, once broad and relaxed, now held a rigid set, as if bracing for an unseen impact. The once boyish softness around his jawline had been replaced by a sharper, more defined angle, giving him a harder, older look. He was thinner, too, the uniform hanging on him with a slight looseness that spoke of lost weight rather than ill-fitting fabric. Milo's gaze lingered on Connor's face as he turned, his eyes sweeping over the waiting faces. There was no wide grin, no boisterous greeting. Instead, a small, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement passed between him and the few familiar faces he recognized. Then his eyes found Milo's across the short expanse of the dusty bus stop. For a fleeting moment, their gazes locked. A small, unsmiling wave, a mere flick of the wrist, was all Connor offered. It wasn't a dismissal, but it wasn't the enthusiastic hello Milo had hoped for either. It was measured, reserved, a new kind of distance. Milo pushed himself forward, his heart thrumming a slightly off-kilter rhythm. He was usually so good at reading people, at understanding the unspoken nuances of a glance or a gesture, but Connor was an enigma, a puzzle he hadn't anticipated. He moved through the small clusters of people, offering quick, polite greetings, his focus unwavering from the figure now retrieving a large duffel bag from the bus's undercarriage. "Connor," Milo said, his voice a little softer than he intended, a little breathless. Connor straightened, the heavy bag slung over one shoulder, and turned fully. Up close the changes were even more stark. His eyes, once a vibrant, dancing hazel, were now a deeper, more muted shade, shadowed by a quiet weariness that seemed to settle deep within them. There was a faint, almost imperceptible scar, tracing a line just above his left eyebrow, a thin white mark against his tanned skin. His hair was cut shorter, military precise, accentuating the sharp angles of his face. He'd always been handsome, but now there was a raw, almost stark beauty to him, honed by something Milo couldn't quite name. "Milo," Connor replied, his voice a low rumble, devoid of its former lightness. He didn't smile, not really. The corners of his lips quirked upward, a ghost of a smile, but his eyes remained serious, watchful. "Let me get that," Milo offered, reaching for the duffel bag. It was a monstrous thing, army green canvas bulging with contents that shifted with a heavy metallic clink. Connor hesitated for a fraction of a second, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes before relinquishing his grip. "Thanks," he mumbled, his voice still low, almost gruff. The bag was heavier than Milo expected, the strap biting into his shoulder as he adjusted its weight. He shifted it, trying to distribute the load more evenly, and glanced at Connor, who was now shouldering a smaller backpack, his movement still economical, precise. The quietness that had descended upon him wasn't just a lack of speech, it was an enveloping presence, an invisible barrier that seemed to ripple around him. They walked in silence for a few paces, the sounds of the town, the distant laughter of children, the whir of a lawnmower, the incessant chirping of cicadas, seeming to amplify the void between them. Milo felt an urge to fill it, to ask 1,000 questions, to bridge the growing chasm. "How are you? What was it like? Are you okay?" But the words caught in his throat, held captive by the gravity of Connor's silence. He looked straight ahead, his gaze fixed on the familiar path, but his awareness was entirely on Connor, walking beside him. Connor, for his part, offered no conversation starters. He simply walked, his head held high, his gaze occasionally sweeping over the familiar storefronts and houses, as if seeing them for the first time, or perhaps seeing them through a new, more critical lens. His hands, Milo noticed, were clenched loosely at his sides, the knuckles a faint white. They passed Mrs. Henderson's prize-winning petunias, their vibrant pinks and purples a cheerful splash of colour against the weathered porch. Milo remembered Connor, years ago, daring him to sneak a single bloom for his mother, a mischievous glint in his eye. Now Connor merely glanced at them, his expression unreadable. "It's good to have you back," Milo finally managed, the words sounding trite and inadequate even to his own ears. He felt a blush creep up his neck. Connor turned his head slightly, his gaze briefly meeting Milo's. There was a faint tremor in his jaw. "Yeah," he said. The single word clipped, almost curt. "It is." He didn't elaborate, didn't offer any details of his journey or his thoughts on being home. Milo squeezed the strap of the heavy bag, his fingers aching. He wanted to reach out, to offer comfort, to break through the impenetrable wall Connor had erected around himself. But he held back, sensing that any overt gesture might be met with a rebuff, or worse, a retreat. Connor wasn't the same boy who'd left, all boisterous laughter and reckless adventure. This Connor was a man forged in a different kind of fire, and Milo, for all his empathy, felt like he was navigating an unfamiliar landscape, unsure of the footing. The weight of the bag seemed to grow with every step, but Milo welcomed the physical burden. It gave his hands something to do, something to focus on besides the churning anxiety in his stomach. He stole another glance at Connor, catching him in the act of observing a group of teenagers laughing loudly near the town square. A flicker of something, perhaps longing, perhaps regret, crossed Connor's face, quickly masked by that familiar, guarded intensity. The air itself seemed to crackle with unspoken words, with the weight of experiences Milo couldn't begin to comprehend. He knew instinctively that this quiet return wasn't just about the physical journey home. It was about a journey far more profound, one that had reshaped the very essence of the man walking beside him. And as they continued their silent trek, the heavy bag a tangible representation of the burdens Connor carried, Milo knew that bridging the new distance between them would require more than just time. It would require a patience and understanding he wasn't sure he possessed, but was determined to find. Garden whispers. Weeks folded into themselves, marked by the slow unfurling of rose petals and the deepening emerald of the garden. Connor remained a ghost in the periphery of Milo's days, a presence more felt than seen. He occupied the quiet corners of the house, his movements a hushed counterpoint to the creak of the old floorboards. But sometimes, when Milo was knee-deep in soil, his hands caked with earth, he would feel the weight of Connor's gaze. It was never overt, just a sense, a prickle on the back of his neck that made him glance up. Connor would be there, framed in a window or leaning against the porch railing, a book in his hand. Though his eyes weren't on the page, they were on Milo, a quiet intensity in their depths that Milo couldn't decipher. There was no judgment, no curiosity, only a stillness that spoke of an inner world too vast and shadowed for Milo to fully comprehend. He never waved, never offered a greeting. He merely observed, a silent sentinel. Milo, in turn, found himself increasingly drawn to these unspoken encounters. He'd prune a little slower, hum a little softer, acutely aware of the observation. He wondered what Connor saw in the methodical tending of the garden, in the meticulous untangling of vines, in the patient coaxing of new life from the soil. Did it offer him a glimpse of a world he'd left behind, or a future he dared not yet reclaim? One particularly sweltering afternoon, the kind where the air shimmered above the terracotta pots, Milo decided to break the silence, not with words, but with a simple offering. He'd been wrestling with a particularly stubborn patch of weeds, the sun beating down on his neck when he felt it again, Connor's presence. He looked up to find him perched on the edge of the porch swing, knees drawn up, staring out at the vibrant chaos of the garden. His expression was unreadable, a familiar weariness etched around his eyes. Milo retreated to the kitchen, the cool tiles a welcome relief. He squeezed a pitcher full of lemons. the tart scent momentarily cutting through the oppressive heat. He added sugar, a generous amount, and stirred until the crystals dissolved, the clinking of the spoon a domestic symphony. He poured 2 tall glasses, ice cubes rattling, and placed them on a small tray. When he emerged, Connor was still there, a statue carved from shadow and quiet. Milo walked across the porch, the floorboards groaning softly under his weight. He stopped and in front of the swing, holding out one of the glasses. "Thought you might be thirsty," he said, his voice a little softer than he intended. Connor's eyes, usually so guarded, flickered with something akin to surprise. He took the glass, his fingers brushing Milo's. The contact was brief, yet it sent a jolt through Milo, a small spark of connection. Connor's hand felt cool, firm. He nodded, a barely perceptible dip of his head, and took a long sip, his throat working. Milo sat down on the other end of the swing, the chains groaning in protest. He took a sip of his own lemonade, the sweetness a balm against the summer heat. The silence that fell between them wasn't awkward, but a comfortable shared space. The only sounds were the distant hum of cicadas, the gentle clink of ice in their glasses, and the occasional creak of the swing as Milo pushed off with his foot. He watched Connor from the corner of his eye. The lemonade seemed to have softened the rigid lines of his posture, a slight easing in his shoulders. He was still withdrawn, but the intense watchfulness in his gaze had mellowed, replaced by a quiet contemplation. Milo wondered what thoughts swirled behind those eyes, what landscapes of memory they traversed. He didn't press, didn't pry. He simply allowed the silence to hold them, a fragile bridge spanning the chasm of their unspoken past. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in hues of apricot and rose. A gentle breeze stirred the leaves of the oak tree, rustling like hushed secrets. Milo felt a peculiar sense of peace settle over him, a quiet contentment in Connor's presence. It wasn't the boisterous companionship of their youth, but something deeper, more resonant, built on unspoken understanding and shared vulnerability. He glanced at Connor again. The last rays of sunlight caught the subtle silver threads woven into his dark hair, a stark contrast to the boy Milo remembered. There was a faint scar tracing the line of his jaw, barely visible, a testament to experiences Milo could only imagine. He longed to reach out, to smooth the worry from his brow, to erase the weary intensity that had become his constant companion. But he held back, knowing that pushing too hard would only make Connor retreat further. He shifted on the swing, the chains groaning a little louder. Connor turned his head, their eyes meeting. This time there was no surprise, no guardedness, just a quiet acknowledgement, a shared moment of stillness in the fading light. A ghost of a smile, so fleeting Milo almost missed it, touched the corners of Connor's lips. It was enough, more than enough. It was a whisper of the man Milo knew, a hopeful glimmer in the vast, new landscape of Connor's altered self. A feathered friend. The next morning, the sun was a painter's palette, spilling gold and rose across Milo's garden. He was out early, tending to the newly budding roses, the air still cool and damp with dew. A flicker of movement at the edge of his vision caught his eye, not among the flowers but near the old stone wall bordering Connor's property. He straightened, trowel still in hand, watching. Connor was there as he often was, a still shadow against the burgeoning light. But today his posture was different, less rigid, more focused. He was crouched low, almost kneeling, his dark hair falling forward, obscuring his face. Milo's gaze sharpened, trying to discern what held Connor's attention with such intensity. Then he saw it, a small, brown bird, struggling on the ground. Its wing was bent at an unnatural angle, a tiny, fractured thing. Connor's hand, usually so hesitant, moved with a startling tenderness. He didn't snatch. He coaxed, his fingers extending slowly, deliberately, until they gently cupped the trembling creature. The bird, surprisingly, didn't fight. It simply lay there, a fragile heartbeat against the warmth of Connor's palm. Milo felt a peculiar pull, a familiar urge to bridge the distance between them. He walked slowly, carefully, across the dewy grass, not wanting to startle either Connor or the bird. When he was a few feet away, Connor finally looked up. His eyes, usually so guarded, held a raw vulnerability that made Milo's breath catch. "It's hurt." Connor's voice was a low rumble, rough with disuse, yet imbued with a profound gentleness Milo had never heard. Milo nodded, kneeling beside him. He saw the intricate network of feathers, the delicate bone beneath, and the subtle tremor in Connor's hand as he held the bird. "Looks like a clean break, if we're lucky." He reached into his pocket for a clean handkerchief he always carried, tearing a strip. "We'll need something to splint it, and a quiet place for it to recover." Connor watched him, silent, as Milo carefully fashioned a makeshift splint. Their hands brushed once, briefly, and a jolt, like static electricity, passed between them. Milo looked up, meeting Connor's gaze. There was no withdrawal this time, only an unwavering intensity that spoke volumes. They spent the next few hours in Milo's sunroom, a space usually reserved for potting seedlings and reading. Connor sat on a low stool, the bird still cradled in his hands, while Milo gathered supplies, a small box lined with soft cotton, a shallow dish of water, and some crushed seeds. The silence in the room was not empty, but full, woven with the soft chirps of the bird and the quiet hum of their shared focus. Milo worked with practiced ease, his fingers nimble as he adjusted the tiny splint, securing it with gentle precision. Connor watched his every move, his brow furrowed with concern. Occasionally he would offer a soft murmur to the bird, a sound Milo barely registered as human. It was a language of comfort, a wordless reassurance that transcended the simple act of healing. As the morning wore on, a comfortable rhythm settled between them. Milo would offer a suggestion, Connor would nod, or sometimes, with a surprising directness, offer a better angle or a steadier hold. They were a team, two halves of a whole, working in tandem for the smallest of lives. The bird, once frantic, seemed to sense their shared intent, settling into a watchful stillness. By midday, the splint was secure, the bird resting peacefully in its temporary home. Milo placed the box on a high shelf, out of reach of curious garden cats. He turned to Connor, who was still standing, his eyes fixed on the box. "He'll be all right," Milo said softly, a warmth spreading through him at the sight of Connor's unmasked relief. "Just needs time." Connor finally looked at Milo, and for the first time Milo saw a faint, almost imperceptible easing of the tension in his face. It wasn't a smile, not exactly, but a softening of the harsh lines around his eyes, a glimmer of something akin to peace. Weeks passed. Every morning Milo would find Connor by the sunroom window, watching the bird. Sometimes Milo would join him, and they would stand in comfortable silence, observing the small creature's slow but steady recovery. They would change its water, offer it fresh seeds, and occasionally Milo would carefully remove the splint to check the progress of the wing. Connor was always there, a silent sentinel, his presence a steady anchor. One crisp afternoon, with the autumn leaves beginning to turn, Milo approached the box. The bird was flitting nervously, testing its wing. He looked at Connor, a question in his eyes. Connor nodded, a rare, decisive gesture. Milo reached in, and the bird, no longer afraid, hopped onto his finger. He carried it outside, Connor following close behind. They stood on the porch, the air cool and invigorating. Milo raised his hand, and with a soft push, released the bird. For a moment it faltered, then beat its wings with renewed vigour. It circled once, a triumphant arc against the pale blue sky, then soared higher, a tiny speck disappearing into the vastness. Milo turned to Connor, a wide smile breaking across his face. Connor was watching the empty sky, his jaw slack, his shoulders relaxed. Then slowly he turned his head to meet Milo's gaze, and there it was, unmistakable this time. A soft, gentle smile that reached his eyes, crinkling the corners. It was fleeting, a whisper of a smile, but it was there. Milo felt a peculiar lightness in his chest, a sense of quiet triumph. The space between them, once so vast and impenetrable, had narrowed. He had seen a glimpse of the man beneath the soldier, the gentle soul hidden behind the guarded eyes, and in that shared moment of quiet joy, a new thread, delicate yet strong, wove itself into the intricate tapestry of their connection. Shared dreams and distant lands. The robin, a swift arc of russet and brown, launched from Connor's palm, a feathered arrow piercing the afternoon sky. Milo tracked its flight until it vanished into the oak's verdant canopy, a surprising warmth unfurling within his chest, wholly unrelated to the sun. Connor's rare smile, a fleeting, almost diffident bloom, had outshone any dawn. It lingered, an unspoken pledge. "He'll be fine now," Milo murmured, the assurance feeling almost superfluous as evidence already soared. Connor simply nodded, his gaze still fixed on the tree, a new wistfulness softening his features. The habitual guardedness, though persistent, had begun to yield, like ancient stone smoothed by a patient stream. Days eased into an accustomed rhythm. Milo often found Connor by the fence line, sometimes gnawing an apple, other times merely observing Milo coax life from reluctant sprouts. Their exchanges remained sparse, punctuated by long stretches of quietude, yet these silences were no longer hollow. They thrummed with unspoken accord, a shared narrative slowly taking shape. One evening, as twilight painted the garden in lavender and deep indigo, Milo discovered Connor perched on the weathered bench beneath the cherry tree. The air hung heavy with honeysuckle's perfume. Milo joined him, offering a mug of chamomile. Connor accepted it with a soft grunt of thanks, his fingers idly tracing the ceramic rim. "Stars are different out there." Connor's voice, a low rumble, startled Milo with its suddenness. He gestured vaguely west, towards the distant horizon, guarding his past's secrets. "Brighter, like diamonds scattered on black velvet." Milo's heart gave a little jolt. This was uncharted territory, an invitation. "Where out there?" he asked gently, wary of pushing. Connor took a slow sip. "Deserts, Afghanistan. You can truly see the Milky Way. No city lights to dilute it." His eyes, usually so sharp, seemed to defocus on some far-off vista. "Sand, fine as flour, gets everywhere. In your boots, in your teeth." He paused, an unreadable flicker in his gaze, but beautiful too. Endless dunes, shifting with the wind. Milo listened, engrossed. He envisioned the vast, hushed landscapes, a stark counterpoint to his own meticulously ordered realm of cultivated rose and vibrant blossoms. He pictured Connor, a solitary figure under those brilliant alien stars, the sand whispering ancient tales. Connor's words were fractured, like shards of a broken mosaic, yet Milo found himself piecing together the fragments, striving for the whole tableau. There was no mention of conflict, no echo of the violence he knew must have marked those distant lands. Only the austere beauty, nature's stark grandeur. "Sounds immense," Milo offered, choosing his words with care, unwilling to shatter the fragile spell. Connor nodded. "It is. Makes you feel small and vast all at once." He stared into his mug, a thoughtful furrow creasing his brow. "Makes you think." Milo waited, letting the silence settle once more, a comforting shroud. He felt a profound sense of privilege, sharing this quiet interval with a man so guarded, so intensely private. The bird, their shared act of healing, had unlatched something, a delicate portal into Connor's inner world. Then a sudden impulse, a need to reciprocate, welled within Milo. He yearned to offer a fragment of his own soul, a glimpse into his most cherished aspirations. "You know," he began, a blush creeping up his neck, "I've always dreamed of opening a bakery." Connor's head snapped up, his gaze locking onto Milo with an intensity that stole Milo's breath. He usually evaded direct eye contact, but now his focus was unwavering, absorbing every word. "Not just a simple bakery," Milo continued, emboldened by Connor's rapt attention. "A place where people come not just for bread, but for solace, for a moment of warmth in their day. I imagine the scent of yeast and cinnamon drifting down the street, drawing people in." He leaned forward, hands gesturing expressively. Warm sourdough loaves, crusty outside, soft and chewy within, flaky croissants, still oven warm, butter melting on your tongue, and cakes, elaborate cakes, for celebrations, for small joys. He spoke of the meticulous craft, the alchemy of flour and water, the patient vigil for the dough to rise, the satisfaction of retrieving a perfectly golden loaf. He described the imagined interior: warm, inviting, with mismatched chairs and a worn wooden counter. He even described the sense of community he hoped to cultivate, a place where neighbours could gather, share stories over coffee and a pastry. Connor listened, utterly still. His eyes, typically so shielded, seemed to soften, reflecting a nascent curiosity. Milo watched him, noting the slight tilt of his head, the subtle flicker of understanding in his gaze. This wasn't the polite, distant attention Milo was accustomed to when speaking of his dreams. This was different. This was intense focus, as if Connor were internalizing every detail, filing it away. He seemed to truly see Milo, not merely hear him. When Milo finally ran out of words, a comfortable quiet settled between them again. Crickets had begun their evening chorus, and a gentle breeze rustled the cherry leaves. Connor offered no advice, no parallel dream. He simply listened. But in that listening, in the quiet intensity of his gaze, Milo felt a profound connection, a recognition that transcended language. It was as if, for the first time, someone had truly grasped the quiet fire that burned within him, the passion he poured into his imagined future. And in that shared space, beneath the fading light of the evening sky, a fragile new thread began to weave itself between them, stronger and more intricate than any before. Echoes of the past. The late afternoon sun, already softening towards evening, dappled through the canopy of ancient oaks and maples, painting shifting patterns of light and shadow on the forest floor. Milo found himself falling into a comfortable rhythm beside Connor, their steps crunching over dry leaves and fallen twigs. Their walks had become a daily ritual, an unspoken pact, sealed after the robin's release. Connor would appear at the edge of Milo's property precisely when the shadows began to lengthen, a silent sentinel, waiting without a word until Milo emerged. Sometimes they walked in companionable silence, the only sounds the rustle of leaves underfoot and the distant caw of a crow. Other times, like today, fragments of conversation drifted between them. Milo had surprised himself by sharing his bakery dream, a secret tucked away in the softest corners of his heart. He'd expected polite interest, perhaps a brief nod, but Connor had listened with an intensity that had both thrilled and unnerved him. There was a directness in Connor's gaze, a depth that seemed to bypass Milo's words and burrow straight into the core of his aspirations. It was a look that promised understanding, an almost visceral recognition of the passion behind the flower-dusted vision. Now, as they navigated a winding path bordered by ferns, Connor spoke again, his voice a low rumble. The sand, it got everywhere, in your teeth, in your clothes, but when the wind died and the air was still, you could hear everything. The hum of the generators, the distant crackle of a radio, sometimes just your own heartbeat. He paused, his eyes, usually fixed on the path ahead, now drifted towards the distant tree line, unfocused, as if seeing something far beyond the familiar woods. And the stars. So many stars. Like someone spilled a whole box of diamonds across black velvet. Milo absorbed each word, each fragmented image, building a mosaic in his mind of a place he'd never seen. He imagined the vast, silent stretches of desert, the overwhelming brilliance of a night sky, unmarred by city lights. A surprising warmth bloomed in his chest, a sense of privilege in being privy to these glimpses of Connor's guarded past. He wanted to ask more, to understand the fear and the beauty intertwined in those memories, but he held back, sensing that pushing might close the delicate door Connor was just beginning to open. A sudden, sharp crack split the quiet air. It wasn't thunder, nor a branch breaking, but something metallic, explosive, like a distant backfire or a small firecracker. Connor flinched violently, his entire body tensed, shoulders hunching, head snapping towards the sound with lightning speed. Milo saw it then, a flicker of raw, unadulterated fear in Connor's eyes, quickly masked but undeniable. It was a fleeting, chilling glimpse into something profound and terrifying. His breath hitched in his throat. Connor's hand, which had been loosely swinging by his side, shot up, almost instinctively reaching for something that wasn't there, before dropping back just as quickly, clenching into a tight fist. The moment stretched, thick with unspoken tension. The silence that followed the noise seemed heavier, more oppressive. Connor remained rigid for another beat, his jaw tight, before slowly, deliberately relaxing his posture. But the fear Milo had witnessed left a lingering echo, a chill that had nothing to do with the cooling autumn air. "Connor?" Milo's voice was soft, laced with genuine concern. He took a small step closer, his hand hovering, uncertain whether to reach out. "Are you okay?" Connor slowly turned his head. His eyes, usually so guarded, now held a deep, unreadable intensity as they met Milo's. It was a gaze that seemed to pierce through Milo, seeing not just his concern, but something deeper, something vulnerable and open. There was a raw edge to it, an almost unsettling clarity. The brief moment of terror had stripped away some of the usual reserve, leaving an exposed nerve. He didn't answer immediately, just held Milo's gaze, and in that protracted silence, Milo felt a profound shift. The unspoken understanding between them deepened, stretching beyond shared dreams and fragmented memories, touching upon the unhealed wounds that lay beneath the surface. It was a look that communicated 1,000 words without uttering a single one. A quiet acknowledgement of the fear, a silent plea for understanding, and perhaps a nascent recognition of the safe harbour Milo offered. Milo held his breath, waiting, his own heart thrumming. He felt a fierce protective instinct rise within him, a desire to shield Connor from whatever horrors lay buried in his past. He wanted to reach out, to offer comfort, but he sensed that any move would be too much, too soon. The air between them crackled with an almost palpable energy, a silent conversation passing between two souls suddenly aware of the precipice they stood upon. Finally, Connor blinked, the intensity in his eyes softening just a fraction, though still holding that unsettling depth. He exhaled slowly, a long, controlled breath. "Yeah," he murmured, his voice a little rougher than usual. "Just a noise." He turned his head away, resuming their walk, but the easy rhythm was broken. The unseen fear now walked between them, a silent, powerful presence. Milo followed, his mind racing, the image of fear in Connor's eyes seared into his memory. He knew then, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that his journey with Connor was only just beginning. Fictional rituals, the days took on a gentle rhythm, punctuated by the sharp understanding that now existed between them. After the incident with the metallic crack, a silent agreement had settled, solidifying Milo's quiet resolve to shield Connor from the jagged edges of the world. And as if drawn by an invisible thread, Connor began to appear at Milo's house every evening. It wasn't a formal invitation, nor did it require one. Dusk would bleed across the sky, painting the clouds in shades of lavender and bruised purple, and then a soft knock would sound. Milo would open the door to find Connor standing there, hands often tucked into his pockets, his gaze distant but seeking. He never said much, just a soft, "Evening, Milo," before stepping inside. At first, Milo wasn't sure what to do with this new routine. He'd offer Connor a cup of tea, or sometimes just a glass of water. They'd sit, often in comfortable silence, the only sounds the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hall or the crackle of the fire Milo always kept burning in the hearth. Connor would find his usual spot in the armchair by the window, his eyes sometimes tracking the last vestiges of daylight, sometimes fixed on the dancing flames. Milo, meanwhile, would feel a curious warmth unfurl in his chest whenever Connor was near. It was different from the familiar affection he held for his childhood friend. This was a softer, more pervasive heat, a blossoming tenderness he hadn't felt before. It hummed beneath his skin, a quiet acknowledgement of something profound, shifting within him. He found himself looking forward to those evenings, a pleasant anticipation building throughout the day. Sometimes Milo would pull out a book, reading aloud from a worn copy of travel essays or a collection of short stories. Connor would listen, his head tilted slightly, a rare, almost imperceptible softening around his eyes. He rarely commented, but Milo could feel his presence, a steady anchor in the room. Other times they would just watch the fire together, the amber light casting long, wavering shadows on the walls. The silence wasn't empty, it was rich, filled with unspoken thoughts and the comfortable companionship that had grown between them. One evening, Milo was reading a passage about a baker in a small French village, describing the scent of warm bread and the camaraderie of the early morning market. He glanced up to see Connor staring intently into the flames, a muscle working in his jaw. The vulnerability from the previous day, though fleeting, had etched itself onto Milo's memory. He closed the book gently. "You're quiet tonight," Milo observed, his voice soft, almost a whisper. Connor didn't immediately respond. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Finally he stirred. "Just thinking?" "About what?" Milo asked, his tone gentle, inviting rather than demanding. Connor hesitated, his gaze still fixed on the fire. "Desert nights, they're different. The stars, they burn." He paused, searching for words. "Here it's softer, quieter." Milo felt a pang of empathy. The contrast must be stark, almost jarring. He remembered Connor's flinch, the raw fear in his eyes. The desert, he realized, was not just a place for Connor. It was a memory, a scar. "Sometimes," Connor continued, his voice barely audible, "the quiet is too quiet. It rings." Milo understood. The absence of a familiar cacophony could be its own kind of torment. He rose from his chair, moving slowly, deliberately, and sat on the rug near the hearth, closer to Connor. He didn't touch him, just offered his silent presence. Connor finally turned his head, his eyes meeting Milo's. There was a flicker of something raw and unburdened in their depths, a momentary shedding of the hardened shell he usually presented. Milo held his gaze, a silent promise in his own. "It's safe here, Connor," Milo said, the words a low thrum in the quiet room. "You're safe." A subtle shift in Connor's posture, a slight easing of his shoulders. He didn't speak, but Milo felt a profound connection, a deepening of their unspoken understanding. The warmth in Milo's chest bloomed, no longer a gentle heat but a vibrant glow. He realized with a jolt that was both startling and exhilarating that this feeling, this burgeoning tenderness, was something more than friendship. It was a gravitational pull, an insistent longing to protect and to understand the complex wounded man before him. And in that moment, as the firelight danced in Connor's eyes, Milo knew their journey had only just begun. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with unspoken pain and uncharted emotions, but Milo was ready to walk it every step of the way. He picked up the old book again, not to read, but just to hold it, a familiar weight in his hands. He watched Connor, watched the subtle rise and fall of his chest, the slow blink of his eyes. The evening rituals were more than just shared time. They were threads, weaving a new tapestry of their lives, stitching them closer together, piece by careful piece. And Milo, for the first time in a long time, felt a sense of purpose that extended beyond the perfect rise of a loaf of bread or the sweet tang of a berry tart. It was a purpose rooted in connection, in quiet understanding, and in the inexplicable, burgeoning love he was beginning to feel. The fire crackled, casting its warm embrace over them both, a silent witness to the profound shift occurring in the quiet intimacy of Milo's living room. The night deepened outside, but inside a new dawn was breaking. Under the storm's embrace, the sky, bruised purple and grey, finally broke. Rain began as a whisper against the window pane, a gentle counterpoint to Milo's voice as he read from a worn copy of Moby Dick. Connor sat across from him on the rug, knees drawn up, gaze fixed on the dancing shadows cast by the reading lamp. The comfortable silence, broken only by Milo's steady narration and the growing rhythm of the downpour, was a balm. It had become their ritual, a quiet anchor in the tumultuous seas of Connor's unspoken past and Milo's burgeoning future. Then, with a sudden, violent crack of thunder that rattled the very foundations of the old house, the world plunged into darkness. The lamp flickered once, then died, leaving them in an inky blackness punctuated only by the distant flashes of lightning. Milo gasped, the book falling from his lap with a soft thud. For a moment a primal fear gripped him, the sudden void echoing an ancient dread. But then a soft click and the scrape of a matchstick broke the spell. A small flame bloomed, illuminating Connor's face, etched with a quiet intensity as he lit a fat, beeswax candle he'd retrieved from the mantelpiece. The warm glow softened the sharp planes of his cheekbones, highlighting the subtle flicker in his eyes as he placed the candle on the low coffee table between them. "Sorry," Connor murmured, his voice a low rumble in the newfound quiet. "Forgot about the storm warning." He reached for another candle, a slender taper this time, and lit it from the first, its light dancing across the room, chasing away the deepest shadows. "It's all right," Milo managed, his voice a little breathy. The abrupt shift from light to dark, from sound to silence, had been disorienting. But now, bathed in the soft, flickering light, a different kind of calm settled over him. It was an intimacy born of necessity, a shared vulnerability against the encroaching night. He watched Connor, mesmerized by the way the candlelight gilded the strands of his dark hair, the subtle curve of his mouth as he blew out the match. The fire in the hearth, long since dwindled to embers, offered little warmth against the chill that seemed to seep in with the rain. Connor, noticing Milo's slight shiver, rose and fetched a thick wool blanket from the back of the sofa. He didn't offer it, but rather sat back down beside Milo, spreading it over both their laps. The simple gesture, unstated and matter-of-fact, sent a surprising warmth through Milo. He leaned into the shared space, feeling the solid presence of Connor's shoulder next to his. "What were desert nights like?" Milo asked, the question bubbling up unexpectedly. The memory of Connor's earlier confession, his struggle with the quiet, resurfaced. He wanted to understand, to bridge the gap between their worlds. Connor was silent for a long moment, staring into the flickering flame of the candle. "Loud," he finally said, his voice husky and full of ghosts. "The wind, it makes sounds you don't hear anywhere else, like whispers or screams sometimes." His gaze was distant, lost in a landscape Milo couldn't begin to imagine. "But the stars," he continued, a faint smile touching his lips, "they were something else. Like spilled diamonds on black velvet. Too many to count." Milo pictured it, the vast, inky expanse, the overwhelming silence punctuated by unseen presences, the dazzling tapestry of the night sky. He felt a pang of something akin to grief, not for himself, but for Connor, for the beauty that must have been marred by the terror. "Did you ever feel safe?" Milo asked, his voice barely above a whisper, afraid to break the fragile spell. Connor turned his head then, his eyes meeting Milo's across the dim space. A faint flicker of surprise, then something softer, passed through them. "Sometimes," he admitted, his voice even lower now, "when you were huddled close and the fire was strong." He paused, his gaze dropping to their hands, resting on the blanket between them. "Or, sometimes, when you found a quiet place, a place where the wind couldn't reach." The air crackled with more than just the storm outside. A tension, delicate and potent, stretched between them. Milo felt his breath catch in his throat, his heart beginning to pound a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He wanted to reach out, to offer comfort, to bridge the last sliver of distance, but a strange shyness held him back. As if sensing his unspoken desire, Connor's hand, resting on the blanket, moved almost imperceptibly. His little finger brushed against the back of Milo's hand. A feather-light touch, tentative and fleeting. The contact, so insignificant, sent a jolt through Milo that felt like a lightning strike. His breath hitched, and a wave of heat washed over him, startling in its intensity. It wasn't just physical warmth, it was a profound, emotional tremor that resonated deep within him. His heart, already racing, now hammered with a ferocity that made him dizzy. It felt as if a dam had broken, releasing a torrent of emotion he hadn't realized he was holding back. This wasn't just friendship, not just concern. This was something else, something vast and encompassing, something that felt like the beginning of everything. He squeezed his eyes shut for a moment, overwhelmed by the sudden, undeniable force of it. When he opened them, Connor was still looking at their hands, his expression unreadable in the flickering candlelight. The storm outside raged, a symphony of wind and rain and thunder, but inside, in the small circle of light and warmth, a profound silence had settled, thick with unspoken feelings and the quiet promise of a new dawn. The electric moment. The air thickened, pressing in around them, a palpable weight woven from the silence and the flickering dance of candlelight. Milo's breath hitched, shallow and quick in his throat, each inhale a struggle against the sudden, overwhelming awareness of Connor's proximity. The earlier brush of their hands, electric and fleeting, still hummed beneath his skin, a ghost of a touch that had rewritten the rules of their shared space. Now Connor leaned closer, the scent of wood smoke and something uniquely his, sharp, clean, and utterly captivating, filling Milo's senses. In the dim light, Connor's eyes, usually guarded and distant, were pools of unfathomable depth, reflecting the dancing flames with an unnerving intensity. They searched Milo's face, tracing the curve of his cheekbone, the line of his jaw, as if committing every detail to memory. Milo felt his own pulse quicken, a frantic drumbeat against his ribs, echoing the chaos blossoming in his chest. He couldn't look away, couldn't break the spell that had fallen over them. Every instinct screamed at him to pull back, to create distance, but a stronger, more primal urge rooted him to the spot, held captive by the magnetic pull emanating from Connor. A low growl rumbled deep in Connor's throat, a sound raw and untamed, barely audible above the whisper of the dying fire. His gaze dropped to Milo's lips, lingering there, and Milo's own lips parted slightly. A silent invitation he hadn't consciously offered. The tension stretched, taut and agonizing, until it felt like a physical entity, pressing down on them, demanding release. Milo's hands clenched in his lap, nails digging into his palms, a small, desperate attempt to anchor himself in a moment that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. Then Connor moved. It wasn't a slow, deliberate approach, but an abrupt, almost violent lurch forward. His hand, warm and calloused, cupped the back of Milo's neck, his thumb brushing against the sensitive skin beneath his ear, sending a shiver down Milo's spine. The contact was shocking, exhilarating, an explosion of sensation that stole Milo's breath. Before Milo could fully process the unexpected touch, before he could even register a coherent thought, Connor's lips were on his. It was a rough, urgent kiss, tasting of desperation and something unsaid, a hungry seeking rather than a gentle exploration. There was no hesitation, no tentative testing of boundaries, just a sudden, all-consuming pressure that stole the air from Milo's lungs. Milo's eyes fluttered shut, his mind a sudden blank slate, consumed entirely by the unexpected ferocity of the moment. He felt a dizzying lurch, as if the world had tilted on its axis, and for a fleeting second he surrendered completely, a silent whimper escaping his throat as his own hand instinctively reached out, grasping at Connor's shirt, crumpling the fabric in his fist. The kiss deepened, a desperate, almost bruising press that left Milo breathless. He felt Connor's body tremble against his, a subtle tremor that resonated deep within him. It was primal, raw, a desperate outpouring of unspoken emotion that left Milo reeling. He tasted something akin to fear, a bitter undertone beneath the surprising sweetness of Connor's mouth. Then just as abruptly as it began, it ended. Connor tore himself away, a strangled gasp escaping his lips. His eyes, when they met Milo's, were wide with a terror that clawed at Milo's heart. The earlier intensity was gone, replaced by a stark, naked panic that twisted Connor's features into a mask of pure agony. His hand dropped from Milo's neck as if burned, and he scrambled backward, knocking over the small table beside him, sending a cascade of books and a teacup clattering to the floor. The sound was deafening in the sudden silence, shattering the fragile intimacy that had bloomed between them. Milo watched, stunned, his lips still tingling from the unexpected contact, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He felt a sudden, sharp ache bloom in his chest, a bewildered confusion that threatened to overwhelm him. What had just happened? What had he done? Connor didn't speak. He didn't even look back. With a guttural cry, a sound of profound distress, he pushed himself to his feet, a frantic energy seizing him. He stumbled backward, knocking against the armchair, then turned and bolted. The heavy thud of his boots on the floorboards echoed through the quiet house, each step growing fainter as he fled, leaving Milo alone in the flickering candlelight, the lingering taste of Connor's kiss on his lips, and the cold, hollow ache of sudden abandonment in his soul. The front door slammed shut, a final definitive sound that reverberated through the very foundations of the house, leaving Milo adrift in a sea of questions, his world suddenly thrown into disarray. Empty spaces. The silence that followed Connor's frantic exit was a physical thing, pressing in on Milo from all sides. It wasn't the gentle quiet of the house when he was alone, but a vast, echoing emptiness that amplified the frantic beat of his own heart. His lips still tingled, a ghostly imprint of Connor's desperate urgency, a phantom heat that warred with the sudden chill creeping through him. He stood rooted to the spot, the scent of pine and something else, something uniquely Connor, a mix of old earth and unspoken pain, fading from the air. Surprise, sharp and immediate, was the first emotion to pierce through the fog of his shock. He hadn't anticipated that. Not the intensity, not the raw, almost violent need in Connor's touch, and certainly not the immediate, terrified recoil. Confusion followed, a swirling vortex of unanswered questions. What had just happened? Why the sudden, uncharacteristic boldness, only to be chased by such profound fear? Milo's mind raced, replaying the scene in an endless loop. The abrupt lunge, the crushing pressure, the desperate pull away. Each replay left him with a hollow ache, a growing sense of abandonment that settled deep in his chest. He moved eventually, aimlessly, his hand rising to touch his lips, as if to confirm the reality of the fleeting contact. The sensation was gone, leaving only a lingering phantom warmth that mocked him. The house felt too big, too still. Every shadow seemed to stretch and distort, whispering of what might have been, what had almost been. He wandered into the living room, the space where so many of their conversations had unfolded, where Connor had slowly, tentatively, begun to shed layers of his carefully constructed reserve. Now it felt foreign, imbued with the ghost of a presence that had been ripped away too quickly. That night, sleep was a distant, mocking promise. Milo lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts a chaotic tangle. He replayed every interaction, searching for clues, for an explanation for Connor's abrupt departure. Had he done something wrong? Said something? The self-doubt gnawed at him, a relentless rodent chewing at the edges of his self-assurance. He was usually so attuned to Connor, so careful. But this had blindsided him completely. The ache in his chest intensified, a dull, throbbing pain that radiated outwards, seeping into every limb. The next morning brought no answers, only a heavier silence. Milo went through the motions of his day, each task feeling rote and meaningless. He checked his phone compulsively, half expecting a text, a call, anything, but the screen remained stubbornly dark, a blank slate reflecting his growing despair. He walked past Connor's bedroom door, a silent sentinel, its closed portal a stark reminder of the empty space within. He even considered driving over to the general store to see if anyone had seen Connor, but the thought felt intrusive, desperate. He needed Connor to come to him, to explain. Days bled into a week, then two. The initial shock gave way to a dull, constant thrum of worry. The confusion remained, a stubborn knot in his stomach, but it was now laced with a bitter understanding. Connor was gone. He had fled, not just from the kiss, but from Milo, from whatever intimacy had sparked between them. The house, once a sanctuary of shared, quiet and comfortable companionship, now felt like a mausoleum. Every object, every corner seemed to whisper Connor's name, a constant, gentle torment. The coffee mug on the counter, the book left open on the armchair, the faint scent of his cologne still clinging to a forgotten scarf. Each was a tiny, sharp reminder of his absence. Milo found himself staring out the window for long stretches, his gaze fixed on the winding road, half expecting a familiar pickup truck to round the bend. The anticipation was a cruel master, building to a crescendo with every passing car, only to crash into disappointment when it wasn't Connor. He stopped cooking Connor's favourite meals, the joy of preparation replaced by a leaden sense of futility. The garden, usually a source of solace, felt like another empty space, its vibrant colours dulled by his own internal grey. The ache in his chest had deepened, morphing from a sharp pain into a hollow, persistent emptiness. It wasn't just the physical absence of Connor that weighed on him, but the void left by the unspoken words, the unfinished conversation, the sudden, brutal severing of a connection he hadn't fully realized how much he cherished. He missed the quiet companionship, the shared silences that were more eloquent than any words, the way Connor's presence had slowly, subtly filled the lonely corners of his life. He missed the challenging questions in Connor's eyes, the hesitant smiles, the way he would lean into Milo's space when lost in thought. The thought that Connor might not return, that this abrupt departure was final, began to take root. It was a terrifying prospect, a future suddenly devoid of the quiet intensity that Connor had brought into his world. The kiss, once a source of confusion, now felt like a desperate plea, a moment of raw vulnerability that Connor hadn't been able to sustain. And in its wake, he had left behind not just a startled Milo, but a gaping hole, an empty space where a burgeoning love had dared to take root. Milo was left with nothing but the echoes of a stolen moment and the crushing weight of an unexplained absence. A distant echo. The scent of yeast and warm sugar, usually a comforting embrace, now felt hollow, a reminder of the quiet mornings they once shared. Milo moved through his small kitchen, the rhythmic kneading of dough a poor substitute for the rhythm of Connor's breath beside him. Weeks had blurred into an indistinguishable stretch of days since the kiss, since Connor had vanished into the humid night. Milo had replayed the moment countless times, searching for a clue, a sign, anything that could explain the sudden, brutal severing of their connection. Each replay brought a fresh wave of confusion, the sweet pressure of Connor's lips warring with the bitter taste of abandonment. He'd walked past Connor's house a dozen times, each glance at the darkened windows a fresh stab of longing. The old truck was gone. The porch light, usually left on, remained stubbornly off. He'd even considered knocking, but what would he say? What if Connor was there and simply refused to answer? The thought was a raw wound, a rejection more painful than absence. Then one Tuesday, while picking up a special order of flour from Mrs. Gable's general store, the casual query from a neighbour twisted the knife deeper. "Heard Connor packed up," Mr. Henderson said, his voice a low rumble across the counter. "Said he was heading down south to stay with his sister for a bit. Needed a change of scenery, I reckon." Milo's world tilted. His hand, reaching for the sack of rye flour, froze. "South," he managed, the word barely a whisper. The air felt thin, suddenly difficult to breathe. Mr. Henderson nodded, oblivious to the earthquake rumbling beneath Milo's feet. "Yep, always did say his sister was good for him. Guess he needed some family around after, well, you know." The unspoken weight of Connor's past hung heavy in the air between them. Milo forced a smile, a brittle mask over the sudden chasm in his chest. "Right. Family." He paid for the flour, his movements stiff and automatic. The truth, cold and unyielding, settled over him. Connor was gone. Not just avoiding him, not just scared, but physically, geographically absent. The distance that had always been a subtle current between them had now become an ocean. He walked home in a daze. The weight of the flour, nothing compared to the leaden despair in his heart. The faint hope he'd clung to, the irrational belief that Connor would eventually reappear, perhaps with an explanation, shattered into a million pieces. He hadn't left because of the kiss. He'd left the town. He'd left him. The thought was a bitter gall burning his throat. That night, the bakery felt colder, emptier. The scent of cinnamon, usually so comforting, brought a pang of loneliness so sharp it stole his breath. He saw Connor everywhere, in the way the morning light slanted across the counter, in the chipped mug he'd always used, even in the faint echo of their laughter from a long-ago afternoon. The house, which had always been a haven, now felt like a mausoleum of lost moments. He tried to bake, to lose himself in the familiar rhythm of creation, but his hands trembled. The bread didn't rise quite right. The pastries were misshapen. He stared at the half-finished loaves, frustration boiling over. He couldn't even do this, not without a hollow ache where his hope used to be. The following morning, however, a stubborn spark ignited within him. He looked at his reflection in the flour-dusted window. Tired eyes, slumped shoulders, a ghost of the man he'd been. This wasn't him. This wasn't the dream. He had a bakery to build, a future to forge. Connor's absence, while a gaping wound, couldn't consume him entirely. He wouldn't let it. He began with a ferocious energy, scrubbing down the counters until they gleamed, polishing the antique display cases until they shone. He experimented with new recipes, driven by a desperate need to channel his pain into something tangible, something productive. He spent hours perfecting a lavender scone, the delicate floral notes a contrast to the storm raging within him. He meticulously crafted tiny lemon tarts, their bright, zesty flavour a defiant burst against the grey pallor of his grief. He pictured the sign he'd commissioned, still rolled up in the back room, waiting for the official grand opening. Milo's Hearth. The name brought a faint smile to his lips. It was his. This place, this dream, was entirely his own. He would make it flourish. He would create a space filled with warmth and comfort, a place where people could find a moment of joy in a freshly baked pastry, a perfectly brewed coffee. The long hours blurred, fueled by coffee and an unyielding determination. He found a strange solace in the methodical precision of baking, the way ingredients transformed under his touch, the reliable science of it all. It was a stark contrast to the chaotic, unpredictable nature of his heart. Each successful batch, each perfectly golden crust, was a small victory against the encroaching despair. He still thought of Connor, of course. The thoughts were like persistent shadows, lingering at the periphery of his vision. But now, when they came, Milo met them with a quiet resolve. He wouldn't forget. He couldn't. But he also wouldn't let the echo of a stolen kiss and a sudden departure define him. He had his own story to write, his own warmth to cultivate, his own hearth to build, and as he kneaded another batch of dough, the rhythmic motion a comforting pulse, he felt a flicker of something new, a quiet strength, born from the ashes of a love that had never truly had a chance to bloom. The bakery's promise. The dust settled, literally and figuratively, over the months that followed. Summer surrendered to autumn, painting the world outside Milo's window in fiery hues before winter's monochrome embrace took hold. Inside, the space that would one day be Milo's hearth was slowly, painstakingly being transformed. The initial despair, a heavy shroud that had threatened to suffocate him, began to recede, replaced by the relentless, all-consuming demands of his new purpose. He learned to distinguish the subtle scent of fresh plaster from drywall compound, the sharp tang of paint from primer. His hands, once accustomed to the delicate dance of kneading dough, now wielded screwdrivers and hammers with growing confidence, albeit with an occasional misplaced thumb. He'd spent weeks scraping away decades of grime from the original hardwood floors, revealing a rich, warm oak beneath. Each splinter, each ache in his back, was a small victory against the tide of his grief. Milo discovered a surprising aptitude for problem-solving. A leaky pipe became an opportunity to learn basic plumbing. A wonky fuse box led him down a rabbit hole of electrical diagrams. His days started before dawn, fueled by lukewarm coffee and an unwavering vision of what this place would become. He was a man possessed, driven by a quiet fury and a desperate need to build something tangible, something that couldn't simply vanish. His old apartment, now feeling cavernous and empty, became a place to sleep, and little else. Most evenings he'd collapse onto a makeshift cot in the bakery, too tired to make the short walk home. He'd lie there listening to the old building creak and settle around him, the silence amplifying the absence that still echoed in his heart. Connor. The name was a whisper, a phantom limb-ache that never truly faded. He still saw him in the quiet moments, the way the light caught the dark strands of his hair, the intense focus in his eyes when he listened, the hesitant curve of a smile that had promised so much. He tried not to dwell, pushing the memories back whenever they surfaced, but they were persistent, like persistent weeds in a garden he was trying to cultivate. He'd found a carpenter, a gruff but kind man, named Arthur, to build the custom display cases and a sturdy counter. Arthur, with his spectacles perched on his nose and his hands scarred from years of working with wood, had quickly become a sounding board, an unwitting confidant. Milo never spoke of Connor directly, but Arthur, with the quiet wisdom of age, seemed to understand the underlying currents of his intensity. "You're putting your whole heart into this place, son," Arthur had observed one afternoon, sanding a piece of cherry wood with meticulous care. "That's a good thing. Keeps you moving forward." Milo had simply nodded, pushing a stray hair from his forehead. Moving forward, that was the mantra. The kitchen, once a dilapidated mess, was now gleaming with new stainless steel appliances. He'd agonized over the oven, finally splurging on a commercial convection model that promised perfectly even bakes. The mixer, a beast of a machine, sat proudly on a custom-built table, ready for its inaugural whirl. Each piece of equipment felt like a small victory, a tangible step towards the future he was creating. He'd started experimenting with new recipes in the evenings, once the heavy lifting was done. The aroma of warm cinnamon, rich chocolate, and yeasty bread began to permeate the space, slowly replacing the smell of paint and sawdust. He envisioned the shelves laden with crusty sourdough, delicate pastries, and robust rye. He imagined the murmur of customers, the clinking of coffee cups, the small smiles of satisfaction. One crisp autumn evening, as twilight bled across the sky, Milo stood in the middle of the fledgling bakery. The lights were low, casting long shadows. He ran his hand over the smooth, newly varnished countertop. It was almost ready. The grand opening was still a few months away, but the skeletal framework of his dream was now solid, real. He felt a pang, sharp and familiar. This was his creation, born from heartache and grit. It was a testament to his resilience, a monument to his refusal to be broken. But there was still a quiet corner of his soul that wished Connor could see it, could taste the bread, could share in this small, hard-won triumph. He pictured Connor sitting at one of the small, future tables, a cup of coffee steaming in his hands, watching Milo work. Perhaps he'd offer a rare, soft smile, a silent acknowledgement of the effort, the transformation. The thought brought a bittersweet ache, a reminder of the quiet presence he missed more than words could say. But then Milo straightened his shoulders. He took a deep breath, letting the scent of warm wood and lingering yeast fill his lungs. Connor wasn't here, and he wouldn't be. Milo's hearth wasn't just a bakery. It was a promise to himself. A promise that he would thrive, that he would build a life full of flavour and warmth, even if it meant doing it alone. The quiet strength that had been born from his pain now settled firmly within him. A foundation as solid as the oak floors beneath his feet. He had a future to bake, and he would do it, one perfect loaf at a time. He turned off the lights, plunging the space into near darkness, and walked out, locking the door behind him. The night air was cold, but a new kind of warmth had begun to ignite within Milo. A rainy reunion. The rain had been falling for hours, a relentless drumming against the newly installed skylights of Milo's hearth. It was the kind of day that invited introspection, the kind that made the warmth of the ovens feel like a sanctuary. Milo, dusted with flour from head to toe, was shaping a batch of sourdough boules, his movements practiced and fluid. The scent of yeast and baking bread was thick in the air, a comforting blanket against the chill seeping in from the world outside. Arthur had left for the day, a quiet nod and a promise to return to finish the display shelves. The quiet was profound, broken only by the hiss of rain and the occasional pop of wood in the old brick oven. Milo paused, wiping a stray curl of hair from his forehead with the back of a flour-dusted hand. He glanced towards the expansive front window, a feature he'd insisted on during the renovation. He wanted the bakery to feel open, inviting, a beacon of warmth against the often grey city sky. Today, it merely framed a blurred tableau of dripping trees and slick cobblestones. He was about to turn back to his work when a flicker of movement caught his eye. A figure stood outside, just beyond the ornate iron railing that now bordered his small patio space. The rain plastered dark hair to their forehead, and the shoulders of their worn canvas jacket were already slick with water. Milo's breath hitched. Time seemed to warp, the familiar sounds of the bakery fading into a distant hum. He knew that silhouette. He'd carved it into the very bones of his memory, etched it into the landscape of his longing. It was Connor. Milo's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drum against the sudden, overwhelming silence in his mind. He straightened slowly, his hands still hovering over the dough. He felt absurdly self-conscious, covered in flour, smelling of yeast and sweat. He hadn't seen Connor in months. So many months that had felt like years. An eternity carved out of grief and the arduous labour of creation. Connor hadn't moved. He simply stood there, his gaze fixed on the bakery, on Milo. The rain streamed down his face, blurring his features, but Milo could still see the subtle changes. He looked leaner, perhaps. The sharp angles of his face more pronounced. His hair was longer, falling across his forehead in damp strands, but it wasn't the physical alterations that truly struck Milo. It was his eyes. They were different. The haunted, restless quality that had once shadowed them was gone. The raw pain, the guarded intensity, the flickering uncertainty, all replaced by something new. His gaze was clear, steady, unwavering. There was a quiet strength there, a depth that felt settled. It was the look of a man who had faced his demons, wrestled them into submission, and emerged, not unscathed, but whole. Milo found his voice, a reedy whisper that surprised him. Connor? The name hung in the air, a fragile bridge between two worlds. Connor didn't speak, didn't move. He simply continued to meet Milo's gaze, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. The rain continued its relentless descent, a natural curtain around their unexpected reunion. Milo took a tentative step towards the window, then another. He wanted to go to him, to throw open the door and pull him inside, out of the rain, into the warmth. But something held him back. The clarity in Connor's eyes, the quiet conviction, suggested a boundary, a new understanding. This wasn't the same Connor who had fled, panicked and broken. This was a different man, standing on the precipice of a new beginning, and Milo intuitively knew that his return was a careful, deliberate act. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched Connor's lips. It wasn't the shy, uncertain smile Milo remembered, nor the fleeting, pained one. This was a smile of quiet assurance, a glimpse of a hard-won peace. He raised a hand, not waving, but a slow, open gesture, as if to confirm his presence, to acknowledge the passage of time and the unspoken journey they had both undertaken. Milo felt a tremor run through him, a mix of relief, trepidation, and a potent, familiar ache that had never truly left him. He returned the gesture, a slow, hesitant lift of his own hand, palm open. The flour on his skin seemed to shimmer in the diffused light. Connor's gaze drifted from Milo to the bakery itself, sweeping over the newly painted sign, the fresh window displays, the warm glow emanating from within. His eyes lingered on the racks of bread, the artfully arranged pastries, the bustling, vibrant promise of Milo's hearth. There was a subtle softening in his expression, a hint of wonder. Then slowly, deliberately, Connor turned. He didn't rush, didn't flee. He simply turned, his movements unhurried, his posture straight. He walked away from the window, disappearing around the corner of the building, into the relentless rain. Milo stood rooted to the spot, his hand still raised, long after Connor was gone. The rain continued its steady rhythm, but the silence in his mind was shattered, replaced by a tumultuous storm of emotions. He hadn't expected to see him again, not like this, not after all this time, all this pain, all this rebuilding, but he had. And in that brief, silent exchange, in the clear, steady gaze of Connor's eyes, Milo knew that this wasn't an ending. It was a beginning, a new chapter, written not in grief, but in the quiet hope of a rainy reunion. He looked down at his flour-dusted hands, then back at the empty space where Connor had stood. The scent of baking bread suddenly felt more poignant, more profound. It was a testament to his resilience, a silent invitation, waiting to be answered. Always have the scent of warm yeast and toasted sugar usually grounded Milo, a familiar anchor in the daily rhythm of his bakery. Today it felt thin, insubstantial, barely there against the lingering phantom of Connor's presence. The rain had stopped, but the damp chill he'd carried inside after their brief, silent exchange still clung to him, a premonition of change. He'd told himself it was an ending, a definitive closure to the ache that had shadowed him. But his heart, stubbornly defiant, had sung a different tune. It felt like a prologue, a gentle ushering into something entirely new. He kneaded a batch of rye dough with unnecessary force, his knuckles white against the resilient mass. Each push and fold was an attempt to channel the restless energy swirling within him. The bell above the door chimed, a sound he'd come to associate with the cheerful bustle of his customers. He didn't look up immediately, lost in the rhythmic work, expecting Mrs. Henderson for her usual sourdough, or perhaps the twins clamouring for chocolate-chip cookies. A shadow fell over his workbench, not the familiar, fleeting silhouette of a customer browsing. This shadow was tall, still, and utterly singular. Milo's hand stilled, flour dusting the back of his fingers like fine snow. He took a slow breath, the aroma of rye suddenly sharper, more potent. He knew, with an instinct that bypassed thought, exactly who stood there. He looked up. Connor stood just inside the threshold, a halo of dampness still clinging to his longer hair. The faint lines around his eyes were still there, but now they seemed etched by understanding rather than pain. His gaze was clear, unwavering, devoid of the frantic energy that had once marked him. He looked settled, at peace, and entirely, irrevocably focused on Milo. The bakery, usually a symphony of subtle sounds, the hum of the fridge, the gentle sizzle of butter on the griddle, the soft clinking of cooling racks, seemed to fall silent, amplifying the soft thud of Milo's own heartbeat. He wiped his hands slowly on his apron, his movements deliberate, almost ritualistic, as if preparing for something sacred. Connor didn't speak. He simply watched, his eyes tracing the familiar contours of Milo's face, the flour on his cheek, the slight tremor in his hands. It was a gaze that spoke volumes, a narrative of shared history and untold longing. There was no urgency in it, no desperation, only a quiet certainty that felt like the sunrise after a long, dark night. He took a step, then another, closing the small distance between them. The air around him felt different, charged, as if he carried a new gravity, a quiet power. Milo felt himself drawn in, unable to move, unable to breathe beyond shallow sips of the flour-laced air. He was a moth to a flame, utterly mesmerized, utterly vulnerable. Connor stopped directly in front of him, close enough for Milo to see the faint freckles dusting the bridge of his nose, the way his dark lashes framed his intense eyes. The scent of rain and something else, something clean and wild, like pine needles and distant ocean spray, replaced the familiar bakery smells. Then Connor reached out. His hands, no longer clenched or hesitant, were steady as they gently took Milo's flour-dusted ones. His touch was warm, firm, an anchor against the tremor that had begun to run through Milo's entire frame. It wasn't a casual touch, or a friendly one. It was possessive, reverent, as if he were holding something precious and long-awaited. Milo's breath hitched. He looked down at their joined hands, his own pale and soft against Connor's more calloused, weathered ones. The contrast was stark, yet they fit together as if forged for this very moment. He felt a surge of emotion so profound it threatened to buckle his knees. Hope, fragile and potent, unfurled within him like a tender bloom. He risked a glance back up at Connor's face, searching for any sign of doubt, any flicker of the old fear. There was none, only that steady, unwavering gaze, deep and true. Connor's thumb moved, a slow, gentle caress over the back of Milo's hand. The gesture was tender, intimate, sending shivers through Milo's arm. He felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, tears he'd held back for months, tears born of longing and the quiet despair of unanswered questions. Now they felt different, tears of relief, of a profound and overwhelming joy. "Milo!" Connor's voice was a low murmur, a sound Milo hadn't realized he'd starved for. It was deeper than he remembered, laced with a newfound resonance, as if he had finally found his own voice, his own truth. "I love you." The words hung in the air, solid and real, echoing in the quiet space of the bakery, in the chambers of Milo's heart. They were not whispered in haste, not blurted out in panic, but spoken with a deliberate, heartfelt clarity that left no room for doubt. Milo's vision blurred. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, then right itself with a gentle thud. He squeezed Connor's hands, clinging to them as if they were his lifeline. Connor's eyes softened, a faint, almost shy smile touching the corners of his lips. He leaned in slightly, his gaze never leaving Milo's. "I always have." The additional words, simple yet utterly devastating in their honesty, shattered Milo's composure. A sob escaped him, raw and uncontrollable. The tears finally fell, hot and cleansing, tracing paths through the flour on his cheeks. He didn't try to stop them. He didn't try to speak. There were no words to match the enormity of what he felt, the sheer, intoxicating relief that flooded his senses. Connor didn't flinch. He just held Milo's hands tighter, his eyes reflecting a quiet understanding, a shared journey, finally reaching its destination. He waited patiently for Milo to gather himself. There was no rush, no pressure, only the profound stillness of two souls finally finding their way home to each other. Milo finally managed a shaky breath, a watery smile breaking through his tears. He looked at Connor, truly looked at him, seeing not just the soldier he'd fallen for, but the man he had become, whole and at peace. And in that moment, Milo knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that this was not just a new beginning. This was the forever he had unknowingly, desperately, always wanted.